All right. Well, we will go ahead and get started. We're so happy to welcome Luther graduates and the Luther Emeriti in the English department back to campus for this special weekend conversation. And what a special weekend and celebration for the inauguration of President Chamberlain, who has long been a member of our EDEV Iowa chapter. My name is Marie Drews, and I'm Associate Professor of English and the current president of Luther's Phi Beta Kappa chapter. Before Martin Clammer introduces our speaker today for our 10th annual Symposium on the Liberal Arts, I just want to say a quick word about Phi Beta Kappa and about this event. Luther College is a Phi Beta Kappa institution, which is a significant recognition of the quality of a Luther education and the commitment the college has made to providing a stellar liberal arts experience, where students pursue breadth in their learning and seek an education of the whole person. Only 10% of colleges and universities have earned recognition as Phi Beta Kappa institutions, a designation that happens through a rigorous application process. Luther's EDEV Iowa chapter of Phi Beta Kappa was established in 1983, thanks in large part to the labor of Dr. Mary Holm Moore, Emerita Professor of English. Each spring, Luther inducts outstanding seniors to be part of Phi Beta Kappa. Inducted students tend to reflect between 8 and 10% of the graduating class. But in addition to those who are inducted, the whole of the college, as well as its alumni, share the honor of being connected to a Phi Beta Kappa institution. It's a community-wide commitment we make at the college to prepare our graduates as people who will be versatile, creative, and disciplined, who will be interested in the public sphere and want to contribute to the common good. This symposium was established in 2016 as Emeritus Professor Will Bunge saw homecoming as an opportunity to celebrate the continued liberal arts contribution of Luther's exceptional alumni and emeriti. And Gracia Grindle was our first homecoming speaker, so welcome. The previous 9 symposia have reflected emeriti and alumni expertise ranging from history, ethnomusicology, English and liberal arts administration, and inclusive directing, teaching, and performance studies. One quick note before I have Martin come up, because there's a lecture that will be held in this room following our event, I'll invite us to kind of gather across the hall in Qualley Lounge where we've got some coffee and some treats as we continue the conversation. But I'd like to welcome Professor Martin Clammer to introduce our speaker.
In January 1993, a very bright first-year student in my J-term class asked to talk to me about a vocational crisis she was having. She enjoyed both her biology and her English classes, each of which, frankly, she was doing well in, and she didn't know which direction to go with her major and potentially her career. I suggested she follow what she was most passionate about. I don't know if what I said actually made any difference. If I know Erin, she probably talked to her mother and father, who are here today, and figured things out for herself. And I have no doubt that had she followed her interest in biology, she would still have had a brilliant and meaningful career, and we'd still be calling her Dr. Erin VanLaningham. But she chose English, and today we have the opportunity to hear Erin speak, interestingly enough, on vocation. Erin is professor of English, chair of the faculty, and special advisor to the president of Loras College. She's also a national leader in the field of vocation in higher education. As director of project development of NetView, which is the Network for Vocation in Undergraduate Education, Erin directs the Scholarly Resources Project, develops and leads NetView seminars, serves as an editor of the journal Studies in Vocation and Calling, and co-hosts a national podcast over the last 5 years, which has produced 40 episodes on vocation and undergraduate education. Erin graduated magna cum laude from English, with an English degree from Luther in 1996, and earned her master's degree at Northeastern, her PhD at St. Louis University. Returning now to her alma mater, whose mission is to inspire and equip students to courageously serve the common good through a holistic education in the liberal arts, Erin will speak this morning on hard times and great expectations, literature, and the call to the good life. Let's give Erin a warm homecoming welcome.
Thank you, Martin. I'm going to take a photograph of all of you because there are so many people here that mean just such a great deal to me. You want to just like wave at me? Hi, everybody. My gosh, this is so special. Thank you, Martin, for that introduction. It's not often in a person's life that their college advisor is still truly their advisor. Thank you to Dr. Marie Drews, to Phi Beta Kappa, and to Luther College for this warm invitation. It certainly feels like a homecoming to me to see so many familiar faces here, especially at this early hour. As I prepared for this lecture, let's see here. Oh dear. Oh, maybe it's, sorry. Okay. I came across this picture that makes me very aware of the journey between me and my years as a Luther student. And this moment in time, yes, that is me and Julie Torkelson Chamberlain at Luther College commencement in 1996. Yeah, right? Isn't that cool? What roads have been traveled to return us both to this place? And I just want to offer congratulations to everyone in the Luther community upon the inauguration of your new president this weekend, and for all the promise that the future holds for Luther College. I had a chance to be at the inauguration yesterday, representing Loris, and that was really special. I just also want to acknowledge the very humbling moment that this is for me, maybe also terrifying, to present in front of the faculty who first introduced me to the works I'm about to talk about. I begin my remarks this morning with a reference to a different homecoming, and that is my return home to Manitowoc, Wisconsin, after my first year at Luther College in 1993. A few things stand out to me about that summer. First, I was armed with a reading list that included the autobiography of Malcolm X and Toni Morrison's Beloved, very earnest about continuing my learning in between my waitressing shifts at the local restaurant. My parents, who are enlightened and accomplished public school teachers, didn't raise an eyebrow when I told them that I had changed my major from biology to English. If they had reservations, they didn't share them with me at that time, and I thank them for that. After a church one Sunday morning, my pastor, who had played a pivotal role in encouraging me to come to Luther, asked me what I had decided to major in. After my response, English, he said, "Excellent. That isn't just a college degree. That is a degree for life." That perspective has proven to be one of the most prophetic things anyone has ever said to me. Pastor Bruce Honstead knew what he was talking about. And while I believe that really any formative liberal arts education provides students with perspectives that will stay with them throughout the life course, they all earn degrees for life. I would like to take the short time I have today to really make an argument for why the study of literature especially prepares us to live a good life. Such exploration of the good life reaches back to Aristotle's notion of eudaimonia, which frames a pursuit of the good life as an engagement with the habits of practicing the virtues. Such virtues like courage, wisdom, justice are principles that we can apply to various spheres and seasons of our life. And when we practice them, we can, in the words of philosophers Megan Sullivan and Paul Blaschko, become better at being human by learning to direct our lives towards worthy goals. Of interest to me is the rise of college classes that students from all different disciplines seem to flock to that focus on purposeful living and communal well-being. Sullivan and Blaschko, both at the University of Notre Dame, have taught the highly popular course on God and the Good Life, and this is their book, The Good Life Method, that talks about that class. Similarly, Yale theologian Miroslav Volf and his colleagues teach a course on life worth living, which explores what they see as the question of our lives and the question, capital Q, that encompasses these ideas. What matters most? What is a good life? What is the shape of a flourishing life? What kind of life is worthy of our humanity? These are important questions, and I'm delighted to hear that so many sign up for these classes to consider them. As an English professor and scholar of vocation, I always turn my attention to the ways that other disciplines in the university also do this work and ask such important questions. Literature, I believe, offers the complexity of such intersections to prepare all of us to better understand, hear, and respond to the callings throughout our lives. So this is an apology or a defense of sorts for the use of literature in our understanding of the calling to the good life. While the study of calling or vocation has its roots in theology, vocare or vocatio meaning a calling or a summons by God, recent vocation scholarship casts a wider framing to include each person's purpose and work and personal roles as a calling that involves domestic and civic realms and political and social life. This is, of course, rooted in Martin Luther's insistence that all people, not just those in religious roles, have a calling. And while some might frame a vocation as a calling from God, others hear that call through the cries and hopes of the world from our communities, our families, our neighbors, along with our own internal compass. Thus, we can explore the contours of purposeful living when we explore how our individual life contributes to the flourishing of others and how the roles we are called to fulfill change over time. When we talk about a call to the good life, we are not talking about the call to wealth, status, or individual success at the expense of others' well-being. We are instead talking about the good life that is felt through a sense of individual purpose connected to a communal flourishing of neighbor and stranger alike. In a recent volume on vocation and the common good, I suggest that vocation is a summons to a place within traditions, communities, cultures, and histories. It is not a place within oneself divorced from others. It is the meeting place between ourselves and the world as we navigate difficult choices, cultivate empathy and curiosity, critically think and reflect, and see the complexity of circumstance. When we pay attention to who we are and what our relationship to the world looks like, we are building a capacity for the good life, and literature helps us do this. I'm trained as a 19th century British literature scholar, what I describe to those outside of academia as a training in all of the best and longest books. These include the impactful tomes of George Eliot's Middlemarch, Wilkie Collins' The Woman in White, Thomas Hardy's Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and the works of the Bronte sisters, Jane Austen, Mary Shelley, and Charles Dickens. As I said, the best and the longest books. As with many professors of literature, the study of narrative and critical theory, a form of socio-historical influence, of cultural context made up much of my training and research. And it continues to motivate my thinking and my teaching. I've taught courses in the British novel, romantic poetry, Irish women's writing, and the spiritual memoir. I also have taught many first-year writing classes and senior research seminars. It is fun to teach all of this, and it is also very hard to teach all of this, especially in this challenging landscape of contemporary higher education. I don't need to go too far in the news cycle to point to the many accounts of those who discount the value of a college degree, the growing resistance to reading and writing, especially now in the age of AI, and the decline of the interest in the humanities. As I've returned each year to my own sense of purpose as an educator and scholar in higher education, I always return to the ways literature invites readers to better understand the call to the good life. This started to inform my research projects and professional roles more directly as I sought to understand the connections between literature and vocation. I've written about the connections between reading and vocation in college classrooms and the ways shared reading experiences help students build a capacity to understand the stranger next beside them and create a ritual of thinking about problems together. I've considered scholarship in narrative ethics, such as Amanda Anderson's analysis of Charles Dickens' novel Bleak House, in which she probes the impact on readers when they consider the lived impacts of the various levels of literacy in the novel. She points to the moment when the street sweeper Joe cannot sign or recognize his name. When we approach literature in this way, we ask, what does it mean to read if we only sympathize but do nothing to mitigate the situations we encounter through reading? Finally, I've considered Middlemarch, in particular, as an exemplar of the ways the novel's capacity for vocational exploration rests in holding the multiple parts and the whole of narrative and tension. Such tension brings meaning and purpose and allows us to see new alternative narratives. This is the study of literature, how literature can invite considerations of the good life. Generally speaking, I believe that educators across the university, faculty, student development professionals, officers in career services and community engagement, chaplains, coaches, cabinet level leaders, can engage with the teaching of vocational exploration with students. And in so doing, they are able to frame the student experience within the larger socioeconomic, cultural, and civic contexts that inform both campus life and public life. They're able to talk about career and life readiness, about purposeful living and how that's rarely straightforward, and that cultivating practices of deep listening and reflection to self and others can help us navigate success and failure throughout our lives. This is part of mentoring, teaching, leading, and living, especially in a liberal arts context. This is what we're doing in many places already. An attention to making the practice more explicit helps students connect various aspects of their college formation. In addition, through such attention to the ways our shared work across the university can better prepare students for their present and future callings, we are able to discern our own vocational pathways and shifts. Thus, while my own examples today draw from my disciplinary training, it is really the questions and framework that they emphasize that I'm offering as a model. Furthermore, I want to be clear that while the exploration of meaning or purpose can and does happen when we hold up exemplars to ourselves or to students of people who have made great contributions to society through their professional and personal efforts, who show leadership informed by virtue, or who inspire in ways that impact others for good, for the most part, literature does not offer us these kinds of examples. I spent a great deal of time consoling students that the characters they meet in books I teach are flawed, and perhaps even extraordinarily unrelatable. Have you ever met Jane Austen's Emma? What about any of the characters in Matthew Lewis's The Monk? Have you considered what it would be like to have dinner with Heathcliff or Rochester in the novels of Emily Bronte or Charlotte Bronte? These are not individuals we see as role models, but instead we understand what it means to be human because of our encounter with them. So let's begin with a few examples. Charles Dickens' 1854 industrial novel Hard Times is not considered a good book. It is regarded by scholars as uneven at best. It has been criticized for its inaccurate picture of labor unions, incoherent in terms of an integrated narrative voice and point of view, and not very artistically written. And yet, the opening of the novel and its statement about education is quoted widely and for good reason. Here, the community leader, Thomas Gradgrind, speaks. Now, what I want is facts. Teach these boys and girls nothing but facts. Facts alone are wanted in life. Plant nothing else and root out everything else. You can only form the minds of reasoning animals upon facts. Nothing else will ever be of any service to them. 1854. The Gradgrind utilitarian philosophy does not stop at schools, but extends to libraries as well. There was a library in Coketown to which general access was easy. Mr. Gradgrind greatly tormented in his mind about what the people read in this library. They wondered about human nature, human passions, human hopes and fears, the struggles, triumphs and defeats, the cares and joys and sorrows, the lives and deaths of common men and women. They sometimes, after 15 hours' work, sat down to read mere fables about men and women, more or less like themselves, and about children, more or less like their own. Gradgrind's daughter, Louisa, is commanded to never wonder. Not too far into the novel, Mr. Choke'em-Child, who is the schoolmaster, Dickens is just great, right? And in a chapter entitled Murdering the Innocents, appears in agreement with Gradgrind's utilitarian viewpoint. Sissy Jupe, another student in the class, represents the value and attraction of fancy, or the imagination. She is the foil to Gradgrind's philosophy. If one did not read any further in the novel, it would still invite contemplation about how to define a good life. What is the relationship between facts and imagination? What is the value of wondering about human hopes and fears? Who are we listening to, Gradgrind or Sissy Jupe, and why? How does this inform our sense of purpose today in framing our individual and collective choices about how to educate? The hard times Dickens refers to draws upon a vernacular phrase common in folk songs, especially between 1820 and 1865. The hard times usually meant a period, often a slump, when scanty food and low wages or unemployment bore particularly hard. It addresses the degradation of life. Hard Times is divided into 3 sections according to the biblical ideas of what it means to sow, reap, and garner. The first chapter takes its title from Luke 10:40-42, the one thing needful. The story of Christ's admonition of Martha for focusing on distractions and Mary choosing what is better. In considering what is necessary in framing a good life, the novel then starts with the premise that perhaps wonder, imagination, human decency are perhaps needful. And the hard times of the novel, of course, invite a consideration of the major question: how does one resist such systemic injustice experienced by Stephen Blackpool, the protagonist in Factory Work? And how does one carry the weight of difficulty and trauma as we consider what it means to live a full and meaningful life? Theologian Deanna Thompson describes this as the ways our callings are informed by deep sadness and the importance of acknowledging and naming the effects of injustice as we live our vocations. The playwright George Bernard Shaw remarks that what Hard Times offers us is a reminder that we do not read novels to escape from them or forget them. Quite the contrary. Some years later, in 1861, Dickens published Great Expectations, a more promising sounding novel in regards to a conversation about the good life. Lisa's like, no, I mean, I'm looking at right here, and my Victorian literature professor's like, yeah, I know, okay? And yet, for anyone who has even opened the early pages of the novel, we realize that Pip's deep desire to become a gentleman, aspirations to climb social classes from being apprenticed to his father figure Joe as a blacksmith to being educated and wealthy enough so as to woo his love interest Estella comes with all sorts of problems. The novel, a Bildungsroman, or a coming-of-age story, is the perfect sort of literature for vocational exploration. What Dickens demonstrates about how one comes to understand purpose and relationship to others and the world is by tracing out the effects of the lack of self-knowledge. Early on in the novel, Pip's humiliation and shame when he realizes how the markers of class label him as undeveloped and backward serve to sever his loyalty to those he loves most. The narrator, Pip, says, "It is a most miserable thing to feel ashamed of home." This is a difficult but rich topic of consideration when we think about our callings to the good life. How does our growth through education or other life experience make us rethink our relationship to our family, our home, our own sense of known identity? How can we reconcile all of these influences, and to whom should we listen? The novel is narrated by Pip looking back on his life. What I wanted, who can say? How can I say when I never knew? This lack of self-knowledge leads him down all sorts of problematic roads and poor life choices. He continues, "That was a memorable day to me, for it made great changes in me. But it is the same with any life. Imagine one selected day struck out of it, and think how different its course would have been. Pause, you who read this, and think for a moment of the long chain of iron or gold, of thorns or flowers that would never have bound you, but for the formation of the first link on one memorable day." I don't want to spoil the rest of the novel, but suffice it to say that the great expectations are neither what Pip or the reader expected, nor are they necessarily great. However, what Dickens gives us in this novel is a consideration of what might have happened had different choices been made with the opportunities provided. We see the dreams of an emerging adult unfold in a context with influences outside of one's control, while also tracing the impact of decisions that cause him to lose his way. This is what Bonnie Miller McLemore describes in her book, Follow Your Bliss and Other Lies About Calling, as the way callings involve both benefits and burdens. Taken together, these literary representations of hard times and great expectations give readers so much to think about in terms of what it means to pursue the good life. In Dickens' panoramic world building, we see the many barriers to it based in a worldview and class structure, but we also see the ways self-discovery, imagination, and dignity emerge in this pursuit. But that is Dickens, you might say. What about other voices and perspectives? How do they invite us to consider the good life? Well, let's take Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston, published in 1937. Here's a book about what Hurston describes as that oldest human longing, self-revelation. The book frames such self-revelation in terms of a Black woman's growth and awakening within the structures of racism, sexism, colorism, and violence of late 19th century America. She writes of the protagonist, Janie, that she saw her life like a great tree and leaf, with the things suffered, things enjoyed, things done and undone. Dawn and doom was in the branches. Hurston's juxtapositions of suffering and joy, things done and undone, dawn and doom, are exactly the parameters of exploring purpose, self-knowledge, and the summons to a meaningful life. Janie demonstrates moments of deep discernment, what Hurston calls a hard thought, to a demeaning speech by her first husband, and placing it beside other things she had seen and heard. Janie decides to leave Joe, and on her journey, she observes, the morning road air was like a new dress. From now on until death, she was going to have flower dust and springtime sprinkled over everything, a bee for her bloom. The narrative resists such unity, however, and Janie encounters further suffering, this time through domestic violence by her second husband, Jody. After this traumatic experience, Hurston explains, Janie stood where he left her for unmeasured time and thought. She stood there until something fell off the shelf inside her. Then she went inside there to see what it was. Such self-examination and reflection moves her to consider the future and imagine her life different from what it was. There is so much to say about this novel, but I want to draw forward one significant piece, and that is the sense of deep observation of self and the world that the novel presents. Certainly, there are important literary arguments about female agency and subjectivity, about the construction of communities, and even the realities of climate disaster. Here, though, for our consideration of how literature might engage with the questions of the good life, I would say that Hurston invites us into a regular habit of observation of our family, our partners, our communities, the natural world, and of our own responses and changes in those relationships. One way Hurston's novel explores how their eyes were watching God is by showing Janie watching throughout the novel, observing the ways she is treated and the status of her inner strength and meaning. Literature and the call to the good life can be seen in what Hurston calls the new dress of the air in the morning road. It brings a certain clarity of purpose through observation and self-revelation. I've obviously spent the majority of my time this morning on narrative, but of course, poetry, creative nonfiction, drama, and so forth also present us with ways to explore meaning and purpose. The study of drama can offer us an avenue to consider what it means to inhabit different roles in the world, to consider what tragedy means for individuals and groups, what comedy can show us about our own shortcomings. The personal essay, like the work of Annie Lamott or Annie Dillard or Mary Catherine Bateson, explores the contours of the good life. For example, in her essay, Composing a Life Story, Bateson links the ideas of composing and writing to composing and music, suggesting that when you do this, you have to look at the change that occurs within a lifetime, discontinuities, transitions, and the growth of various sorts, and the artistic unity, like that of a symphony with very different movements that can characterize a life. I'll end here with a consideration of poetry, drawing from the work of Stephanie Johnson and her exploration of the ways poetry invites us to embrace ambiguity, paradox, and the multiplicity of meaning. When I think about the ways literature invites us to develop capacities for purposeful living in a complicated and at times unwelcoming world, I often think of William Wordsworth's poem of Homecoming, or what he calls revisiting, in lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey on revisiting the banks of the Wye during a tour, July 13th, 1798. The return to the Sylvan Wye helps Wordsworth to bear what he describes as the heavy and the weary weight of all this unintelligible world. The return to the riverbanks allows him to return to himself, changed but also familiar. There are many poets whose work lend themselves to conversations of the good life, including Mary Oliver, Wendell Berry, and Ada Limon. I'll point here to this poem by Lucille Clifton, published in 1987. entitled, "I'm Not Done Yet." Clifton writes, "As possible as yeast, as imminent as bread, a collection of safe habits, a collection of cares, less certain than I seem, more certain than I was, a changed changer. I continue to continue. What I have been most of my lives is where I'm going." The language here of possibility, of certainty, and change directs the reader to consider the cares and habits that inform who the speaker is now and who the speaker will become. The idea of continuing to continue is such a wonderful iteration of life in the anticipation of where one is going, bubbling like yeast under the surface. The poem I'd like to close with is by my Luther classmate and fellow English major, Jill Osier, an accomplished poet living in Fairbanks, Alaska. Jill lived across the hall from me senior year in Larson Hall. I love her 2017 poem Elegy, which meditates on a treasured visit to a library. An elegy is a poem that invites reflection, focused emotion, and sometimes lament. It is certainly an invitation to consider the contours of a good life. Jill writes, "Not every day, but most days that summer, I went calmly and quietly and climbed to the 6th floor of the library and walked not fast and not slow, but with purpose down the last row and reached almost without looking to the same place on the shelf and pulled out the large book and carried it to a chair that looks out toward the ridge, to a mountain that is there. Whether it is or it isn't, the mountain people love, maybe for this, love and die with all their love, trying. And I opened to the page where I left off before, and sometimes the library announced it was closing. Sometimes I got hungry. Sometimes it looked like rain. I'd close the book and carry it again, with purpose, back to its exact place on the shelf. And I'd walk down the stairs and out of the building, and it was like I'd left it ticking." On the face of it, the journey Jill describes in the poem of taking a book off a shelf again and again and returning it to its place ticking with life and possibility is a familiar experience for many. The elegy reflects on the familiarity and measured pace of the visits to the library, of what it means to look out beyond the confines of her experience and after a while return the book until she will visit again. She invites us to consider how we approach a familiar story, not fast, not slow, but with purpose. She invites us to think about how we carry the story each time. And yet, we might ask, what if the journey to the library is metaphorical, symbolic? That the return to a place in a narrative that is about love and death of a mountain we can see or not see is also about what it means to return to a familiar psychological or emotional or spiritual shelf that we learn more about each time we visit. I, of course, can't help but make the connection to the shelf Hurston references inside of Janie. The poem invites us to return to the unfinished book again and again. I'll close with some final wisdom from the Pulitzer Prize-winning writer Barbara Kingsolver, who describes reading short stories after a painful and tragic moment in her family's life, saying, "The stories were for me both a distraction and an anchor." I believe that this is the gift of literature to the consideration of the call of the good life, that it allows us to be distracted enough from the hard times and even great expectations of our lives so that we can see them more clearly. It also gives us ways to carry the effects of the contemporary realities of public life and bear concern for the future. It offers us an anchor in those very realities to keep us connected to our inner compass and to those with whom we share a common life. When we invite students and each other into conversations about meaning and purpose, we are grasping for these sorts of anchors and distractions. Any discussion of the purpose of a college education ought to include a discussion of what it means to live a good life and support the flourishing of others. Hard times and great expectations abound. The study of literature gives us but one way to navigate the journey. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Where'd you go to college? We have time for some
Questions? Yeah. Yeah, Mark. Yeah.
So you talked about the loss of reading among young people.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose it's one of a question that sort of answers itself, but I mean, you use the content of books to help draw people into reading, or do you somehow get them to read and then discover, oh, there are some things in there? I mean, what is the process?
Yeah. Yeah, Marie, do you want to help me with this question? Anyway, it would definitely be the first thing. There's, I mean, not a magic formula, and you know, to get people to read necessarily outside of class anymore. But what I've actually taken to doing, and I actually talked about this in a chapter called Reading with Strangers, our collective vocation, and how reading helps us sort of generate practices for like the common good, you know, sort of reading in community. One of the things I took to doing was actually kind of like this, where it's like you put a piece of, you know, what they were supposed to have read for the day. But then maybe asking, right, for maybe some, you know, initial sort like reactions to that, and then maybe find 3 more things in the book. And so by the end, we've kind of created a collective reading, you know, as a method. That's one thing I started doing. I've taught Annie Lamott's book, Traveling Mercies, a fair amount in my spiritual memoir class. And I will say that sometimes being able to pull forward an example that gets half of the students who see themselves in the narrative and half that don't, sometimes then generates more interest in the reading itself. There's a chapter in there that I really like to teach, because we teach in Iowa, that talks about barn raising. And a lot of the students at Loris, where I teach, come from Chicago, and they have no idea what this is. And then a lot of the rest of the students are from small towns in Iowa, and they all know what a barn raising is. And so the conversation around that particular part then sometimes builds capacity or interest. There's the strategies for reading are complicated, you know, for all of us now, but all I can say is that it's like the practice of it in the classroom is, for me, just about the only way I can actually generate any sort of movement, you know, towards even some of the conversations that we want to have, like, how should we be educating people? What do you think about this facts situation that we're talking about here? Those kinds of things. Yeah.
I appreciate this very much. I was thinking theologically that people say that you really are teaching people to live only this life, and to be a Christian is to remember the past and think of the future.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think this is a great way to do it. It's a wonderful way.
Mm-hmm.
But it worries me a little, the journey into the self.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because we're so narcissistic, and the self, as a Christian, I think, is a wasteland.
Yeah, you're probably familiar with the writer Parker Palmer, who has a book, Let Your Life Speak, which has been kind of it's like a return to tome again and again. But one of the criticisms of that book about vocation is that it's so individually focused, which is one of the reasons NetView and we chose to do the fourth book in a series of books that we have on the common good and the ways in which our vocations are connected to others flourishing. So first of all, vocation is not just your own personal odyssey or, this sort of internal wasteland, as you say, but it's definitely connected to other people and to, the sacred and spiritual callings sometimes people talk about of ancestors, of, sort of larger narratives in the world so the more that we can sort of unpack that for students, I think that dislocates the narcissism. And that's where I feel literature is just one of the best places to do that, is to sort of say, look at how all of these worlds are connected. And so that, the conversation about the past, the present, and like the not yet, or sort of, what is to come, it opens up a lot more sort of robust conversation about vocation. I appreciate the comment about narcissism. Yeah, David?
I was thinking about the inauguration yesterday.
Yeah.
Couple things. Two, actually, that I'd like to comment on. One is Brad Chamberlain shows a text about being called, hearing God calling.
Yeah.
He used that phrase quite.
He used it pretty directly, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm wondering what you think about this idea. I had a friend who did not like the
Mm-hmm.
poem because that's not part of vocation text.
Right.
The second thing is the way he started his own talk with the poem.
Mm-hmm.
About persimmon seeds and geese.
Yeah.
And what that did for what he then said afterwards and started with a work of literature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was really delighted to hear President Chamberlain start with that poem, and I think some of us were talking, when he said a poem, Wild Geese, and they said by Wendell Berry, I thought, oh no, that's the wrong poet. There's a poem, Wild Geese, called by Mary Oliver. Oh no, is Brad starting wrong? And I thought, no, he's not. Like, he's clear. Then he started reading the poem, and it was a different poem, Wild Geese. So he taught me something. I thought it was rhetorically a very important start for a scientist to start with poetry, because it was the embodiment of the liberal arts right there. And that I thought I really, really appreciated that moment, and I thought that was awesome. And I was unfamiliar with the poem, and I was just delighted with the ideas of the seeds in it, because to me, that's probably the better way to talk about vocation or summons. It's like the possibilities or the ways in which we are called into like community, or like sort of, and what it will take to nurture such vocations and purpose, institutional vocation or individual vocation. The language of calling is, in vocation scholarship, very problematic for a lot of people in higher education. So if you come from a spiritual tradition and that is something that resonates with you, it really works. But for some, it's very alienating. And so sometimes we talk about, like purposeful work, or sometimes even talking about being summoned it suggests like, well, what or who is summoning you? There sometimes is a different way. And so, for me, the language of calling works, but I think understanding what or who is calling is the thing that I think for President Chamberlain, it's very clear that it's a calling from God. I would say I think that's that's his way, which great. But I think for others, maybe to broaden that out might that would be the way that they would have to talk about it with students or for themselves. Yeah.
Hey, Erin.
Hi.
Welcome here. I think purposeful work and vocation, quite frankly, I understand these literature profs do this, because knocking at the door, coming inside the head into what increasingly is the wasteland of late capitalism is AI.
Yeah.
And all the electronic distractions and forces, in my view, that are looking to convert the space that literature fills and opens, and from which literature emerges into a site of profit for itself. So I think for us and for our students, talking about purposeful work, talking about the spaces that are open here, which I think is something we can agree on regardless of whether we call ourselves Lutherans, or Christians or whatever, is a space to say to our students, you are more than a consumer. You are more than a source of data that is extrapolated from you and used to make billionaires and trillionaires. And I think this is something that, quite frankly, the world needs and the world needs to hear right now.
Yeah.
So bravo for
Thank you, Amy, for saying that. And yeah, it does feel urgent. It feels more urgent than ever. And in the circles that I run in, I'm lucky now. I'm working on another book on vocation, higher education in the future. And really, the argument of the book is vocation is the thing that liberal arts colleges do. And it is the thing that we can offer as hope in the face of all of the things that are leveled against us. And it restores humanity. So to the point about sort of like getting inside of yourself to the point where maybe you just like, paralyzed, or you're so overwhelmed by the world's, pressures, whatever those are for you. The restoration of humanity, and then your ability to contribute. There's agency in vocation. It's not, vocations are not free choice. There's a lot of things that impact one's calling. There are barriers, there are lots of those things, but it does restore humanity and it is empowering. I like the language people have been using. Andy Chan is he works in vice president for career services at Wake Forest, and he's developed all sorts of things around career and life readiness. And he has just like amazing things where, students line up to take a 1-credit class on life readiness. It's like, oh my gosh. It's amazing to me that actually students want that. They don't know that until they, it's like right in front of them, but then they're like, oh, sign me up. And he's got wait lists for these classes. And also, the other thing, there's a huge study out of Harvard about human happiness and flourishing of like 20-somethings and global. And the main things those folks are searching for is sort of purpose and meaning in work and life. It's vocation. So it's something like we, in a context like this, know and do, and we understand. I don't know that I would have known that in 1992 when I got here and I read Habits of the Heart by Robert Bella with Mary Hull Moore in my very first Paideia class. But my goodness, I quoted that book in this book. And it's like, that's what this is about. This is not new. We are doing it, but we need to be better about sort of arguing about it. And Chamberlain did talk about that yesterday, saying like, this is what the world needs. And it's true, it is. So we hope it'll come forward.
We have time for one more.
Okay.
I saw Lisa's hand.
Lisa's hand, yes, Lisa.
So you're hearing from all your English professors. We love you so much. So it's very good. Nice to have you back. Free choice and agency is crucial in understanding that. But one thing I've sort of came to me over years of reading and rereading these long novels is the profound anxiety and challenge of choice, mostly visited upon the young men in novels who, like Fred Vinci, or I'm trying to think of Ada's boyfriend in
Bleak House.
and how he dies.
Right.
Because he can't pick a vocation.
Right.
Fred Vinci is borderline.
Yeah.
Because he can't, until he finds a vocation, he's going to be wasted.
Yep.
And so there are these repeated stories of people in the new world of being able to, you don't have to be a button maker because your dad was a button maker.
Right.
There's a repeated narrative. The 19th century authors are just channeling how terrifying it is to have that vocational decision thrust upon individuals. So what I'm wondering is, have you found your students resonate with that?
Yes, yeah. So then we're talking about Middlemarch here. So again, read this in 1995 with Lisa Kildegard. But anyway, so Fred Vinci, poor old Fred, it's like flunks out of Oxford and all this, and then he's going to become a farmer, and okay. But the whole book is like, it's like a crisis of adulting. I mean, it's just like, cannot make a decision, or he wasn't even aware of like how to make the decision. And yes, that is so resonant with students. So it is problematic when we teach vocation, especially with first-year students, because they're all like, well, I better figure that out by like November, and that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about figure out your vocation by November and you haven't even chosen a major or whatever. And it's not a vocation, it's plural, callings, right? Vocations, because this is an unfolding. And this is where I do think the sort of, theological arc of vocation, if we, whether or not we use that is helpful, because it's, it talks about it over a long trajectory of time. And that's where the Victorian novel in particular is helpful, because it shows the steps. Like this is painstaking and difficult. It doesn't, and also, it doesn't need to get resolved right this minute. In the book, I had mentioned Bonnie Miller McLemore's book, Follow Your Bliss and Other Lies About Calling, which is just a great book. But she talks about blocked callings, unrealized callings, callings that never, happen, these kind of fractured callings, things like that. And I think like that language might be helpful too, because it's like, yeah, you had hoped for such and such. Brad did talk about this a little bit yesterday too, and with organic chemistry being this gatekeeper. You had hoped for that, and maybe that didn't happen. But now this other thing is here. So there's, I think, like kind of the elasticity of it is something that we as mentors or people that are walking alongside students can help. And it's important for everybody to learn it, right? I mean, because this is not something that students are going to remember necessarily here. They'll remember it 10, 15 years, 20 years down the road, right?
Well, this has been a very rich conversation. Let's continue.
Thank you.
Across all
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
We have coffee and treats across the hall. Please join us.
Thanks, Martin. Oh, thanks.
Just engage us in such great conversation.
Thanks.
Wow.
I don't know what you think of my reading of Their Eyes Were Watching God, but
I wasn't going to call attention to this, but you recall that this was your second lecture with the college.
I didn't want to make too